in the past. And don't you wanna be free from all you see, not scared it won't last. We're sticking to our guns, we've got a chance to make a difference in this life. But I wonder if you're leading me on. We're sticking to our guns, we've got a chance to make a difference in this life. But I wonder if you're leading me on.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Future Plymouth 2030. This webinar is about Plymouth and the Southwest climate issues, and we have three very special guests with us this evening. We have Professor Iain Stewart. He's Director of Sustainability Earth Institute at the University of Plymouth. We also have Paul Barnard, who's Service Director for Strategic Planning and Infrastructure at Plymouth City Council. And they'll be covering and setting the scene of our climate emergency. And then finally, we also have Hamish Hall from WSP as Head of Water Team, and he'll explain how we're increasingly having to design with flooding and the rising sea levels in mind. We want this to be really interactive, so please use the chat box. Also at the end, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions live to our panelists. But as we're going through, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen as well. We'll also have some interactive polls way through as well, so watch out for them. First, I'll put you through to Sarah Lee, along with Claire Bower, who's been working really tirelessly and organising this webinar series. So I'll put you through just to introduce the webinar. Sarah.
Hi, thank you for joining us. As Miles said, I'm Sarah Lee from Stride Brown Architects. I've also been the REBA Chair for Plymouth for the last 4 years. This idea was born this time last year, with my REBA hat on. I was invited to a Devon climate emergency thematic hearing specifically about how we could reduce the carbon in our built environment, which is obviously a hot topic for all of us, one that we've been talking about for decades, and now finally that the climate emergency was declared last year, we seem to be talking more seriously about how we can challenge that, what we can do about it. So the idea of this webinar series, it was going to be a physical event, but obviously we can't do that because of coronavirus. But we see this as an opportunity to open debate and discussions across our different professions, across our industry, about the different topics associated with climate emergency in the built environment and the carbon reduction. So whether it's aimed at students, lecturers, practitioners, just normal, you and me, just normal people. We all use buildings in this world. We have houses, we have supermarkets, we have shops, we have schools, and we just want to look at the design of new buildings and also retrofitting existing buildings. So we met Paul Hardman, who works at the Sustainable Earth Institute with Professor Iain Stewart back in January, and that's been set up recently to bring together all the different faculties of the university who have input into sustainability, which unsurprisingly covers most of them. It's not just about architecture, who we work with the architecture department very closely already. It covers all sorts of building surveying, planning issues, energy issues, engineering issues, psychology, how we change behaviour. So we also work very closely with the council, who've obviously made their climate emergency declaration too, and have an obligation and an action plan that they need to update annually and report back on how they're doing, how we're doing. So we saw this as a forum for everybody to join together to discuss and debate and look at how we can do things better. So we really hope that you'll keep an eye on the website. That's been set up as a central place where bookings can be made. You can see what's coming up. We've got a whole series of probably 6 to 12 months even of webinars that could happen. Got so many people that want to speak. So keep your eye on that. The programme is developing. There'll be more going up in the next couple of weeks. And that's probably enough from me. So may I please introduce our first speaker, who we're very pleased is Professor Iain Stewart of BBC fame. You've probably seen him on TV. Director of the Sustainable Earth Institute, and he's going to talk about the climate emergency on planet Earth. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Thank you. Can you see my screen? Just making sure that you can see that at the moment.
Yeah, we can see it.
My messy slide thing, so let me just pull it up full screen. So that should be my open slide. Can you, everyone seen that okay? I don't want to start off when no one can see anything. So great, thanks for that. So yeah, I'm director of the Sustainable Earth Institute, which you've just heard as a kind of a one-stop shop around all things sustainable within the university. I'm a geologist by background and really been involved in making television documentaries about climate change. I'm on the Devon Net Zero Task Force, and I'm communications lead for the Scottish Climate Assembly that's happening right now north of the border. So I'm interested in climate change, communication of climate change, and that's what I want to talk to you about. And the talk really starts a million miles away from here, or many thousands, in Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific, because it's here in the late 1950s that a scientist called Dave Keeling starts to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, the knowledge of carbon dioxide as a warming agent in the atmosphere has been known about for 150 years, but in terms of actually measuring it, it wasn't really started until 1958, 59, and you can see those measurements here, and you can see the rise and fall, the seasonal variation of CO2 in the atmosphere, but also you can see the broad rising trend. And that rising trend was apparent even in the first few years. In fact, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson, as president of the US, in a statement to Congress, has this line: "Air pollution is no longer confined to isolated places. This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through radioactive materials and a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels." So the science of climate change really was already well established by the early 60s, such that the leader of the US was talking about this as just a matter of fact. That then leads to, we have to wait for 2 decades really for the first World Meteorological Conference, where all the climate scientists getting together. They recommend the start of the initiation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an advisory group that really assesses the science. We have Margaret Thatcher speaking to the UN in 1989, talking about this critical development of negotiating a framework convention on climate change, the first world leader to really talk about climate change as something of international organization. And then in 1990, we have the first report of the International Panel on Climate Change. So our knowledge of the kind of the institutional international framework around climate change is very long-standing in terms of the knowledge that carbon dioxide is having that effect. And yet, when that started, the CO2 levels was something like 312 parts per million. I checked the other day, as of start of the week, it was 412 parts per million. And you think 100 parts per million, that's not really much. Well, in the long-term perspective, it is. This is a really long-term perspective, a geological perspective, 800,000 years of measurements of carbon dioxide measured from ice cores in Antarctica in particular, showing the planet oscillating between 180 and 280 parts per million, going from ice ages, where it's got very low levels of that greenhouse gas, to a more greenhouse, less ice on the planet when we have higher levels. And that fluctuations is the orbital changes of the planet. So it's got nothing to do with humans. Modern humans, in fact, only come in around about 200,000 years. So we've got a record of CO2 in the atmosphere measured 4 times longer than modern humans have been on the planet. And yet what you see coming out of the last ice age, which ended about 20,000 years, is a steady increase as usual, till you would expect around about the turn of the 20th century for it to start falling again, but it doesn't. It keeps on going. It goes through 300, 350, 380, 400, 412. Completely unprecedented. You have to go back tens of millions of years to find the planet at those kind of levels. And why is that? Well, what we're seeing here is the kind of industrial era, really tracking both our burning of fossil fuels, of coal, of gas, of oil, and it's the kind of parallel effect on atmospheric CO2. So the little box shows you the instrumental record of Dave Keeling that we saw from Mauna Loa. And what we see on the left-hand side is hardly anything happens really in terms of the Industrial Revolution and through the 1800s and early 1900s. And then it really starts to take off. And then what we see in the right-hand side of the line rather, is what would happen in a future world if we continued on that trajectory of business as usual, as we call it. And we see carbon dioxide parts per million going up to 500, 600, 700, 800. Again, you have to go back into times when the North Atlantic Ocean is not there to start to get those kind of measurements. So this is a geological change that humans are actually affecting on the planet. As a result of that and the warming action, we know about temperature. We've been measuring temperature really instrumentally since the 1850s in the UK. And we've got steadily broader and better coverage in the oceans, on the kind of extreme parts of the lands, and indeed in different levels of the atmosphere. And what we can see is a kind of general low levels of temperature close to the pre-industrial levels in the 1800s and early 1900s, and then that steady incline. You can see the list of coldest years on record, which are generally late 1800s, early 1900s. And then on the right-hand side, the hottest on record is 2016. And it was last year, and it was 2017, 2015, 2018, you get the picture. We're switching across into much more warmer than a long-term average temperatures. Of course, a big question is, maybe there's some natural, we know there's natural changes going on. We know that the orbital changes can have an effect. That's what drives climate in the long term. But we also know that other things volcanoes, for example, can cause fluctuations. So the Met Office, for example, has got its supercomputer that runs a lot of the climate models, essentially the same model, a stripped down version that actually does the weather forecasting. So the basic physics of the weather of climate are the same. It's just as you extrapolate them out, you strip it back and you have some more simple versions. And what you see in that graph is the blue line is what we should expect. We run the models, we understand how they calibrate them to what's happening. We run them backwards, check them against kind of our historical record and see how accurate that's been and tailor them. And we see that if we just try and explain, the total changes you can see in black is what's actually happened. What you see is if you just have a natural effect in there, you get the blue line. So you see ups and downs of various volcanoes, etc., and the solar activity, so the activity of the sun. And we see that it tracks pretty well until the mid part of the 20th century, and then natural processes continue flatlining a little bit, and you see the temperature kind of rise up. And the thing that tracks it's anthropogenic. It's that burning of fossil fuels and other anthropogenic greenhouse gases. So as a result of what we have now, the latest IPCC report was in 2014, and the statements there are pretty similar to the very early studies that came out in the 70s. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal. Basically, since the 1950s in particular, these changes are unprecedented in the record we've got. That the levels of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are, again, unprecedented in the last 800,000 years, nearly a million years. That human influence on the climate is now just clear, that 95 to 100% probability that the warming in the second part of the 20th century up to today has been dominated by human influence. The magnitude of the changes are starting to be seen as severe, pervasive, and most worryingly irreversible. And if we're not going to continue with new policies, the business as usual model is going to rise, it's going to produce temperatures of 3.7 to 4.8 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And this graph really shows us a very simple relationship that basically as we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which is in the horizontal axis, temperature, which is in the vertical axis, goes up. And what we can see is that how much we warm, because there's that direct relationship with CO2, the amount that we warm is dependent on the amount of carbon dioxide we put in. So it's not just a case of slowing down our rate of increase, because any increase in CO2 will have a warming effect. We need to get our emissions down to net zero. And you can see the projections of the kind of business as usual model there. If we don't, you can see by 2020, we're already a 1.5 degrees Celsius above what we expect. But if you continue on, by the time we get to 2050, it's 2.5. By the time we get to 260, maybe a 3-degree rise in temperature. So all of that really leads us to why we had a big, the Paris Climate Agreement, the COP, the Conference of the Parties in 2015, which remarkably ended up in an agreement to try and limit temperature increase to well below 2 degrees C, and to attempt to pursue it to limit, in fact, to 1.5 degrees C, which is what the argument is. Beyond that, we think we're going to have these irreversible tipping points in climate. But it's something more than just the science in terms of the Paris Climate Agreement, because that agreement of almost every country, I think there's something like 3 that didn't do it, is based on principles of what's called equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. What does that mean? Well, let's unpack that a little bit. Equity. There are some countries that are more responsible for emissions than others. It's not evenly distribution. So here we see 3/4 of the emissions is produced by 10 countries or unions of countries. You can see here China, United States, and the European Union are the big 3. That the bottom 100 countries account for only 3.5% of the emissions. So there's something around social justice here, and international justice about who should be doing the most about this. And the UK is part of, I was going to say it's part of the European Union, how inappropriate anymore, but as part of that European industrial set of countries is a big emitter. Probably more relevant to the UK is the idea of responsibility, because CO2 hangs around in the atmosphere for decades. So a lot of the CO2 that's up there causing the warming now is CO2 that we've put up there from our industrial revolution that's really dominated the UK over the last couple of centuries. So we're ranked fifth for total carbon dioxide emissions. And much of that is this role that we've had as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. I put the Newcomen engine there. If you want to see one, you go to Dartmouth. The Newcomen engine was what led the tin mine extension. The James Watt tinkering with it allows us to go deeper. Development of coal mines, all of that takes off, and it gets us our industrial wealth, but it also produces this incredible environmental legacy. So there's a huge responsibility on some of these countries to do more than other countries. And then finally, capability. Who is most capable of change? Well, we're pretty wealthy. We're wealthy in terms of GDP, 6th out of the 2003, but we're also wealthy in capability in terms of resources. We have lots of options. So we've got different energy options, for example, and options in other ways. So we have the capability to do more than some other countries. So those 3 things collectively suggest that UK could and should be a big driver in that global leadership. Now, this is the scary one. This is what Paris has said we need to do. So what we can see here is there's a rise in emissions. We need to peak and have them go down as soon as possible. If we'd started back in 1990 when we first had the IPCC, the first report, etc., we would have had a very gentle yellow-shaped curve down that we could have taken a leisurely time about this. But that intervening time period has meant we now have a really dramatic fall in order to get down to net zero. So that means we have essentially a climate emergency. That's what we mean by that. That's why people are getting agitated. That's why people are taken to the streets as well. And that's really motivating change, because as we'll see here, this is a graph of the percent of the public that is essentially worried about environment enough to have it as one of the top 3 issues facing the country. And what we see is it broadly sits underneath 10% through the last decade or so. It spikes above that when we have extreme weather, like in 2014 with the floods, that comes to the attention of the news media and the public. But you also see that steady rise more recently, which is Greta, the climate strikes, David Attenborough and him really coming out, kind of talking about climate change as a big issue. And of course, groups like Extinction Rebellion taking to the streets and making this a very public issue. However, before we get carried away, this is everyone's coming on board. This is a plot showing the concern about climate change across the population over the last decade in a different way. Now, on the face of it, it's great. 80% of the British public are now fairly or very concerned about climate change. But what you'll see is that in 2019, the values are pretty similar to what they were back in 2008. That is, most people are broadly concerned about it. There's some that aren't very concerned. There's a small amount, residual amount, not very concerned at all. But what it shows you is that actually broadly people are concerned, but we're still not doing very much about it. So there's a big change that has to motivate people from a broad passive concern to actually doing action, and it's action we desperately need. Why is that? Well, this is from LAC, a survey that we done last year, looking at segmenting the public into different publics. There was something similar in America called the 6 Americas. This is the 5 UK publics. And what it shows you, for example, on the left-hand side is the 5 publics, that there's some people highly engaged in this. There's other people moderately engaged. There's other people that are action wary. In other words, they recognize there's an issue, but they're wary about doing something. And then there's a group that's uncertain, and then there's a group that actually thinks it's not a problem. And what you see there is how those things change as we go through different aspects about how it's important, whether we should have taxis, etc. So people might accept that there's climate change, but what we do about it is a much bigger problem. And you'll see that even in the groups, in terms of opinions, that the majority of people are in the messy middle, hard to reach, hard to enact. So the last slide really here just introduces you to, I think, the issue that I think is a big one. It's not about the science. The science is settled. Science was settled in the 1960s. The issue is how we connect to people to turn their broad concern about climate change into action, such that they support really dramatic and effective changes. And on the back of that, I just want to play a really short video about how it's all about framing. It's about reaching multiple publics in different ways with different messaging. And so I just want to play this video about one way that we see in the Southwest as having a lot of opportunities to sell that climate message here. So let me just play this, and hopefully it'll work all right. People know that this is a different kind of place, you know, that we live in the landscape, in the environment. It's the natural wilds and wonders of the Southwest, but actually driving the economy through that.
The Southwest is a natural powerhouse. It's got these amazing geo-resources underneath the ground. It's got the opportunity for floating offshore wind. And I think a powerhouse is when you take the most of all of these separate opportunities and work with them together for the same purpose.
I think a really important facet here is that we are able, in the Southwest, to leverage world-class research and use it and apply it to the business world.
Looking 20, 30 years down the line, things like offshore wind, things like geothermal energy, things like more intelligent use of our natural resources, then trying to create a sense of real community to go forward.
Well, it's hot down there. Geothermal energy is heat from the earth, and it's the ability to use hot water from the ground to produce electricity. It's clean, green energy, and we need that to move forward.
We have a real opportunity here in the Southwest to take the lead in deployment of new technologies for offshore and marine renewable energy. Wave energy, tidal stream and floating offshore wind, and the power in the waves is evident every day.
One of the aspects about the natural powerhouse is trying to be smart about this, and by smart I mean
looking ahead, what is coming down the line, and being able to manoeuvre yourself in a position that you're ready for it.
We have minerals and resources here that aren't anywhere else in the UK, and we have geothermal energy here. The rocks are hotter here than anywhere else in the UK.
It's about understanding that we are an integral part of the environment that we live within, that humanity isn't separate from nature in some way, it's part of it. If we're going to transform the economy to one that's truly sustainable, we have to engage with all of those natural resources.
So it seems to me that the natural powerhouse is an essential contributor to the success and long-term well-being of the South West.
So I think there's huge opportunities there in terms of, as we move forward for that climate challenge, ones that will produce green jobs and a new kind of vision really particularly for the South West. So I think there I'll end it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Iain. That was really interesting. Thanks for being with us today. If you have any questions for Iain, please send them in by clicking the Q&A button. We've had a few already, which we'll go through at the end. Also, if you want to maybe just ask your question directly, you can raise your hand and when we've got the Q&A question at the end. Next, we have Paul Barnard, who's the Service Director for Strategic Planning and Infrastructure at Plymouth City Council. And I'll hand it over to you, Paul.
Okay, thank you. Let me just share my screen. Can you see anything there?
Nothing yet at the moment, Paul. Whilst Paul's trying to sort out the presentation there, I forgot to do a couple of polls. So whilst we're waiting, so the first question is the issue of rising sea levels and increased risk of flooding a concern to you? So you should have a poll come up on the screen now. If you're looking at if you're viewing Zoom via the web app, you might not be able to see this. So if you could select your answer, the answers you can select are no, won't affect me, or partly, or not directly affect me, but impact the wider community, or yes, my property or place of work will be affected.
Can you see that now?
That's brilliant, Paul. Yes, we can see that now.
Okay.
And we'll see the answers to this at the end of Paul's presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thanks again for the opportunity to share some of the work that the City Council is doing with partners across Plymouth to address the existential issue of climate emergency. And Iain has sort of set out the historical and international context very well. What I want to do is very much focus on the actions we're taking and the context of those actions. So I'll be very much focusing on what we're doing and what we intend to do. I guess starting with the UK government position, and particularly in light of the slides that were shown earlier, the UK Parliament was the first in the world to declare a climate emergency, and we also have, of course, legislation in place in the form of the Climate Change Act, which commits us to net zero by 2050. So, of course, the the national position is to address climate emergency in a UK policy context by 2050. And of course, the government have made an announcement today about their 10-point plan in relation to that. However, of course, local government, generally speaking, in response to this challenge, now over 74% of local authorities and other agencies and professional institutes have declared a climate emergency. The vast majority by setting a target of net zero by 2030, some still sticking with that 2050 date, and a small number of those not setting a date. In Plymouth's case, we declared a climate emergency in March 2019 with a plan to make Plymouth carbon neutral and net zero by 2030. So I really want to focus on what we've done to date and our plans to achieve that. I guess the first thing is the creation of the action plan, which was approved by our full council on the 16th of December. And you'll notice on the front cover there that it says Plan 1 of 11, a recognition that we need to instigate action straight away to address these decarbonisation of various sectors, but also recognising, as I'll say at the end, the need to ratchet up actions as we move towards 2030. In terms of the sort of vision, this is our vision to get to net zero. So significantly improving energy efficiency of buildings. Buildings represent 31% of total emissions within Plymouth. All of the city's future heat and power from renewable zero carbon sources. Zero emission vehicles as standard with expanded EV charging infrastructure in place on every single street within the city. Again, I'll say a bit more detail about that later. The whole city having good air quality. We do have air quality management areas at the moment, but the whole city having good air quality. A system of mobility and transport, which is constructed around a high quality public transport offer, because inevitably the role of public transport, notwithstanding its current challenges, is going to be key in connecting different parts of Plymouth, jobs to homes, to leisure, but also connecting the city to wider markets and obviously nationally. Next, large-scale natural habitat and ecosystem restoration is very much part of the game plan. And lastly, and on the back of us launching the first commercial electric ferry recently, that ferries and boats within the city will be zero carbon. So that's the basic vision that we've set out in the Climate Emergency Action Plan. And again, to reflect that point about the different stages, but the need to ratchet up actions, we've defined these sort of three phases. The first phase we're obviously in now, the emergency response, the things that we need to instigate now, the different behaviours that we need to challenge now to get things going, recognising that the challenges of that we're facing from an economic and a social point of view in light of recent events. Then what we've described as a short transition phase as we ramp up the delivery and we begin to change those behaviours and begin to see successes from the actions that we've begun to implement in the first few years. And then deliberately the acceleration phase, where we're really accelerating the decarbonisation of the economy, the decarbonisation of transport, the decarbonisation of power and heat. All of that linked, as I said, to issues around behavioural change. So turning to the emergency action plan itself, it contains 75 actions around those themes, 5 themes: power and heat, mobility, buildings, engagement and waste. Why those? Because those represent the most significant areas of carbon generation, and therefore what we have to decarbonise to get anywhere near net zero by 2030. We've recently reported on progress with these actions publicly, so all of those actions are underway and a number of them have been completed. But as I said earlier, there is a very clear recognition that we need to move on from these initial actions to the actions that we need to put in place for next year. And you won't be surprised to hear that we're working on the second Climate Emergency Action Plan, which we will be reporting to our City Council in January. as was touched upon by Iain, the whole issue of people's response is key, and I'll say something in my closing remarks about this, but engagement is absolutely central to this whole agenda. So we've put in place some governance arrangements around the whole climate emergency issue, which is cross-sector, working with partners. We're organising a programme of climate conversations to bring key stakeholders together. Our view has been that should be action orientated, as opposed to having an extended debate about the science or an extended debate about how we should do things. We recognise it needs to be collaborative, but the very strong political view in Plymouth is that it should be action orientated. We need to drive forward the delivery of actions that are going to make a difference. We're working positively and creatively with the high emitters, so we know who the high emitters are within the city, and we're working with them in relation to their own carbon footprints. The City Council is one of them, even though the City Council only itself accounts for 1% of carbon emissions within the city. How can we share best practice and take action together? So an example would be where there is innovative sustainable travel policies in one sector in relation to, say, the dockyard or the University of Plymouth. How can we transplant that to and apply the same principles to other parts of the big organisations who are the big emitters within the city? And an example of some of the community and school events that we've been doing to harness enthusiasm and to get the challenge of young people pushing the decision makers to make these decisions that are needed is, for example, the promotion work that we do, sustainable travel work we do with schools to encourage walking and cycling, to encourage a different way in which we travel about and to get young people engaged in that agenda. Turning on to some of the sort of areas that we've been working on, there are already passive house and zero carbon schemes within the city, but we're working with Plymouth Energy Community around a Dutch energy sprong model, which is a particular form of net zero housing. We're looking at modular housing, modern methods of construction, and a programme of carbon-free homes. So some of those things have already been delivered, but again, we're looking to ratchet those up. We also need to recognise that Plymouth's going to be delivering around 30,000 homes in the next 15 to 20 years, but there's 100,000 homes there already. It's called Plymouth. And of course, many of those are of varying ages and of varying standards in terms of the quality of their insulation and their energy efficiency. So clearly, we need to do lots more, not just around vacant homes, but the existing housing stock. And I'm pleased to say that working with Plymouth Energy Community and others, we are working to address the most inefficient buildings within the city and targeting those fuel poor households who, as was touched upon earlier, often the most deprived communities, the most vulnerable communities are those that are actually affected by climate change. And we need to make sure that in all the actions that we take, we recognise that, and we recognise that already disadvantaged communities are not further prejudiced by the necessary actions that need to be taken to address the climate change challenge. Looking at the next section, power and heat, these are big challenges. In order to meet our targets, as I hinted at earlier, nearly all heat generation in buildings needs to be decarbonised. We're already installing ground source heat pumps and solutions in the city centre of Mill Bay. Our planning policies have now recently been altered to require developers to put three-phase electricity supply in all new buildings, and that helps with, for example, the installation of photovoltaic. So we get down to a level of detail that is necessary to make the practical changes that will help decarbonise, in this particular instance, housing and power and heat generation. On mobility, clearly walking and cycling is fundamental to the overall transport strategy and hierarchy within the city. We're delivering 4.7 kilometres of new off-road cycle routes. We've got a programme of 503 electric charging points with 100 electric charging workplace charging points that will be going in, have been going in during this year. We'll be providing grants to businesses to encourage sustainable travel. So that will, for example, the installation of cycle racks, cycle storage, showers, that sort of thing that would encourage people to walk and cycle to work. And as I mentioned earlier, the first UK commercial ferry that is electrically powered from an old Nissan Leaf engine has already been launched, and we're obviously looking at rolling out electric ferry infrastructure across the whole of the city, given the nature of Plymouth and its relationship with the water. One of the key things that we're doing as part of a 96 million Transforming Cities Fund programme, our flagship project are be somewhere in the order of 30 to 50 multimodal mobility hubs across the city, as you can see here, involving electric charging stations, involving an electric car club, electric bikes, and also charging points. And the objective behind this programme, which will be located across the whole city, we're looking at sites at the moment, and we'll be consulting with stakeholders early in the new year, is obviously to, again, reduce carbon emissions, but improve mobility to some of those low-income neighbourhoods, and to make electric vehicles at least an option that is a viable and affordable option, improving the access and connectivity to places of work across the whole city. Waste is a big issue, plus recycling, so we recognise that. Waste generation is clearly an issue. Clearly, we need to reduce issues of packaging and waste that's generated in the first place. We're looking at the number of recycling bins in high retail and high footfall areas. And of course, this whole initiative around waste links to other things that we're doing as a city council, working with partners around, for example, the contamination that is caused by plastics in our environment, and in particular in our Plymouth Sound and in the oceans, and some of the work we're doing around our plan for plastics. We also need to recognise that some of the actions that we've set out in the Climate Emergency Action Plan do require sort of further practical assessments, as I hinted at earlier, in terms of their impact. Are we doing the things that are having the most significant impact in decarbonising areas of activity and sectors? And of course, there is inevitably a cost issue that needs to be addressed. Of course, there is a huge cost to doing nothing, and that is often something that is overlooked in some of the debates. The cost of doing nothing at its most extreme level is clearly a fundamental breakdown in society and how it operates. So clearly, do nothing is not a zero-sum game. But you can see some of the other things that we're planning here around looking at bus fleets and our own sort of vehicles, and looking at ultra low emission vehicles, looking at air quality issues, EV car clubs, as I mentioned earlier. We're working on a local walking and cycling infrastructure plan, again, to incentivize the delivery of walking and cycling infrastructure in the city, and also looking at how some of our pricing mechanisms and charges, fees and charges, can incentivize zero carbon travel in line with our commitments to a public transport based and zero carbon mobility challenge. And then there are some other things that we need to do at a national level. Clearly, the City Council can't do all of this itself, and Plymouth can't do all of this itself. So there are things that need to be changed at a national level. Today's announcement is certainly a welcome announcement in terms of what the government have set out in their 10-point plan. But clearly, there's more to be done in terms of, for example, the National Planning Policy Framework and how we deal with planning issues, and how the planning system can help deliver zero carbon development, issues around the energy efficiency of buildings. By 2025, when the government have said that they will introduce what they call a future housing standard, there should be 1 million more homes in this country to meet the various aspects of affordable and housing need that this country has failed to deliver in many of the last decades. But that's 1 million homes, if built to current building regulation standards, that are actually going to make the problem worse. So you won't be surprised to hear that as a city council, we are lobbying the government to bring that standard forward. They've just done that in their 10-point plan in relation to phasing out diesel emissions from 2040 to 2030. We say that new housing standard should be brought forward sooner. So clearly there are things that we need to lobby for with government. And again, practical things like how transport schemes are assessed. The way transport schemes are assessed by the Department of Transport, the way in which those schemes are assessed effectively biases road construction as opposed to outputs that come from walking and cycling and public transport measures. Change the appraisal tool, you change the funding that goes to walking and cycling and public transport, as opposed to road construction. I should say, though, in passing, I don't think that's an argument for no more road building, but it is changing the balance between the two. And as I hinted earlier, we're also lobbying the government on changing various laws in relation to how we can deliver as a nation a response to this agenda. So just a few examples of some of the things that we've progressed. We're looking at a zero carbon development in King's Tamerton. We were lucky enough to secure 3.3 million of funding for energy and efficiency measures under the Green Homes Grant. I mentioned the electric charging programme and the Transforming Cities Fund. And as you can see, there's a number of cycle network improvements that we've been undertaking in Lara Bridge and the Barbican and elsewhere within the city. So that programme is going to be significantly increased over the coming years. We're looking at heat networks, high energy generating buildings in the city centre. So there's work that's been going on for a number of years in relation to that, and that involves ground source heat pumps and also investment in electric network infrastructure, which raises all sorts of issues about the markets and how we can access those electricity markets and address issues of the cost of running some of these buildings and making that a deliverable choice for operators and for new developments. And so the city centre and Mill Bay has been our focus of attention in recent years. I mentioned that the City Council in December last year agreed the Climate Emergency Action Plan as its response. So within sort of 6 or so months, it had moved from a declaration of the climate emergency to a series of actions that it was committed to delivering, which as I've said and as you've seen, we are in the process of delivering. But what it also agreed to do was to review its overarching strategic plan. That's known as the Plymouth plans. All the key strategies of the City Council are now reflected in one plan called the Plymouth Plan, and the City Council agreed to revise that and to reflect the commitment of the climate emergency declaration. So the current indicator in that plan is a 50% carbon reduction on 2005 levels by the end of the plan period in 2034. And although it contains a number of very supportive and proactive policies around low carbon and encouraging low carbon responses as part of our consideration of planning applications, nevertheless, it was the view of members that needed to be ratcheted up. So we undertook a consultation in September and October. We've received a number of responses, as you can see, from a wide range of groups on our suggestions for improvements. And hot off the press, these are some of the suggestions that people have made as to how we can change that strategic policy that the council works to across a range of issues. So you can see that perhaps not unsurprisingly, but in a very welcome way, that there was strong support for changing the carbon neutral target to 2030. So that will be recalibrated and will be formally part of the council's policy framework. You can see that people are asking about some of the detail about how the target was going to be reached. So was there an over-reliance on technological solutions was one of the questions that was raised. You know, how are we going to engage communities in this agenda rather than perhaps relying too much on technology? How can we minimize carbon emissions? How can we support more walking and cycling and public transport? Do we recognise the importance of our own green and blue infrastructure, given the unique nature of Plymouth's environment? 43% of Plymouth's land area is green and blue, and how can we ensure that new developments are utilising renewables such as solar panels, green water harvesting, etc. And some comments about food waste and the role of community energy schemes. And again, Plymouth Energy Community and ourselves are working around together to look at how we can support community energy schemes coming forward. Lastly, I wanted to talk about a few related initiatives, but where the climate emergency issues are now feeding into to our thinking. So one of the things that we do as a planning authority is that we secure contributions from developers through something called the Community Infrastructure Levy. Effectively, it's a tax on development. To date, we have secured funding for 93 community projects through what's called the neighbourhood proportion of that levy, which has supported 1.5 million of investment. But linked to that, we have changed our criteria for this policy and introduced what we call a climate emergency bonus and increased the level of funding that can go to individual projects. And now a climate change community generated project can now secure up to 45,000. And we're currently in, and this is all live. So if you'd like to go to this site and look at some of the really exciting schemes that are being brought forward. Let me find my notes. Here we are. Yes, so there are 7 exciting schemes that communities have come up with. I'm going to quickly run through them so you're aware and encourage you to go and pledge on the crowdfunder site. So the first is rewilding of wooded areas in the city. The second is pollinize, looking at addressing issues of bee decline. Moss to a Flame is linked to the COP programme, Plymouth Energy Community taking that forward. Collins Park, looking at rainwater harvesting. A group, the Tyres Project, looking at reclaiming tyres that are dumped in Plymouth Sound and recycling those. AFOL, indicating to communities and partners about how recycling methods can be used. And lastly, there's a nappy project in relation to reusing nappies. So those are all community generated projects that are currently being considered and will be part of a live event that's going to be held on the 3rd of December, where the finalists will get some further funding to develop those projects. So all community led projects that are addressing climate challenge issues, and there needs to be more of that, which is why we changed the City Change Fund to support that. We also know clearly that we're in an unprecedented public health crisis. Clearly the climate emergency crisis predated that, but there is now a public health crisis, and our Resurgam programme is looking to address the reconstruction of the Plymouth economy and the challenges that have come from the impacts of COVID-19. And you can see that we're looking at how we can create a Green Deal for jobs, that could include, for example, things, and again, embedding the whole notion of recovery of the city, given the COVID-19 has had. And then lastly, I just want to, we obviously have our own areas of, so that's looking at our buildings and our fleet. And so we're looking to move towards electric alternatives. We've already made a significant number of acquisitions. We're looking at the way in which we deliver services, the way we work programme. We're looking at how we procure things, and we're looking at the capital investments that we do, whether that's the box or road schemes or other things. So some brief examples: we've updated our social value policy, so our procurement strategy now explicitly reflects issues of climate change. All of our capital projects are now assessed from a climate change perspective. We're in the process of reviewing our fleet, as I said, and we're planning to replace the diesel vehicles with electric alternatives. And we're rolling out a huge program of LED traffic lights, which have significant decarbonisation benefits in relation to some of the highway maintenance works that we do and will continue to do in order to, again, reduce the energy use and to reduce the carbon from those developments. So my final thoughts are this, really. We've always been clear as a city council that as a democratic organisation, we have a clear leadership role in this space, and that's obviously not me as an unelected officer. That's the elected councillors of the city council. So there is a key leadership role for the city council for that reason. I think the city council has to step up to the plate because of that democratic role that it plays. Secondly, we've been equally clear that we can't deliver it all on our own. Action is clearly needed at the level of the individual communities, which is why I mentioned the local projects, individual organisations, local places, nationally and internationally, as we've heard. So we're open for the challenge. We're open for innovation. We're not afraid of that. And we're, despite all of the impacts that COVID-19 has had, we will want to continue the climate conversations. And we know, don't we, that that we have to be serious. And I think there is a very stark recognition that this existential issue is something that we do need to take seriously. We do need to ratchet up the actions year on year. We do need to be action focused in order to get anywhere near that very strong commitment to deliver the ambition of net zero by 2030. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Some great things there to think about. If people want to get in touch with you, Paul, what's the best way they can go about it?
Yeah, just email me at paul.barnard@plymouth.gov.uk. All of the things I've mentioned are on the on our City Council website, so you should be able to get through that as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And again, if you have some questions for Paul, please send them in by pressing the Q&A button, or you can wait to the end to raise your hand. Just before we go on to Hamish, we will do the results of the poll. So the question was, is the issue of rising sea levels and increased risk of flooding of concern to you? So 75% partly will not directly affect me, but impact the wider community. Just one more poll before we go on to Hamish. So here, should flood prevention and mitigation be a key part of the local planning development policy? I'm also voting. I just want to say a big thank you to our key partners for this webinar, the European Union Development Fund, the University of Plymouth, Her Majesty's Government, the RIBA, Building Plymouth, Constructing Excellence Plymouth Club, Stride Triglowen, and Plymouth City Council. So that one's a definite there, yes there with 96%. And I'll tee up just one more and we'll share the results afterwards. Here's just one more poll. So should flood prevention and mitigation measures be paid for by central government, regional, local government, a flood levy applicable to all new developments, a combination of all above or none of the above? So there is a combination of the above with central government at 12% as well. So our last speaker this evening is Hamish Hall. He's WSP's head of water team in the UK. And I'll hand it over to you, Hamish.
Hello, thank you for having me. Try and start my video. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be invited to speak here, not least. Oh, I can't share my video, or is that on purpose? There we go. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be invited to talk here, not least because I'm a graduate of the University of Plymouth, where I studied civil engineering, and I specialised in flood and coastal risk management, for which Plymouth is well renowned and continues to be a strong player in that field. And I'm also still in touch with Plymouth, working on their university steering board to make sure that the new graduates that come on really do understand the issues about managing flood and coastal risk, which is very important. So I'm just going to talk to you about that as I try and work out to share my screen. Bear with me. I've got too many screens open at the moment. Let's try that. There we go. Are you seeing that screen coming through? Miles?
Yeah, sorry, Hamish, that's fine.
Excellent. All right. So I shall kick off. I'll start off probably by teaching you all to suck eggs. So the sea goes up and down a couple of times a day in the UK, and that's because of the moon and the sun to a certain extent, and the daily tidal variations are really very predictable. But you can see here a plot from the weekend when it was really windy. The predicted tides, actually for the high tides, were quite a lot lower than the actual observed tides for Plymouth. And so why did that happen? And the reason I'm talking about this is I want to explore uncertainties in current flood risk management before we even start thinking about climate change. So over the weekend, we had a series of low pressures that brought very strong winds from the south and southwest that physically pushed water up along the Plymouth and south coast. And in addition to that, we had very low pressure as well. So there wasn't enough weight pushing down on the sea, so the sea rose up, which is why we saw this coastal surge. So whilst the tides are very predictable, the height that they get to actually is quite uncertain. And here you'll see a graph of design water levels taken from the Environment Agency and government website across a range of return periods. And so I'll just probably explain return period. A 1 in 1 year event down here, which might happen once every year. A 1 in 1,000 year event is going to be far less likely. And you can see here a peak water level increases with the severity of the event. Now, of course, we haven't got very long records, so predicting this far out actually isn't that certain before we even start thinking about climate change. So I need to hold that in your head. But we're going to try an interactive poll now when we move on to sea level rise. So I don't know, Miles, if you can do it while on here. Is sea level rise happening now? I ask this question quite a lot at public meetings, stakeholder engagement workshops, because there's still quite a few people who either don't know or don't think it's happening. So I don't know if we've got a result in there. Excellent. All right, one denier, one person doesn't know, or 1%, shall I say. So I'll just draw your attention to the annual mean sea level plot for Newlyn over the last just over 100 years, which we can see a very, if you ignore the noise, a strong trend upwards. And that pretty much correlates with the graph that Iain showed right at the beginning with our increase in CO2 emissions. So sea levels are rising at the moment. And now I want to ask you, why are they rising? So our next poll, if you could. So is it because of the melting glaciers? Is it raining too much? Have we got too many surfers in the southwest visiting us, displacing water? Is it the North Pole melting? And let's see what your answers are. I don't know if they've come through yet, Miles.
Nearly there, 60%.
Excellent. That is confusing. We hear about ice melt a lot in terms of sea level rise. But of course, we've got many sources of ice. So yeah, as expected, really, we've got melting of glaciers and the ocean warming as it expands. So you are clearly a very intelligent bunch. And I'll just put up the IPCC fifth assessment report showing sea level rise. That's a total with the uncertainty around it. The biggest contributor is actually thermal expansion. So the sea getting warmer and expanding. And I really like this sort of way of looking at things because we know that temperature's going up. We've seen the graphs. We know that CO2 is going up and we've seen the graphs. And there's a direct correlation between temperature and sea level rise. So it's no putting off to tomorrow. There's no serious lag in all of this. As the temperature rise, our sea levels will go up and it will get faster. So I'll just explore this RCP 8.5 a little more for you. So we have 8.5 projections of sea level rise modeled, I should say here, and 2.6 down there. All of those assessments of sea level rise are quite severe over the next 100 years. And let's just look at it. So the RCP, this is the language that we're using in the climate change assessment at the moment, is representative concentration pathways. But broadly speaking, 2.6 is the lowest, and that requires a massive shift in our policy in how we manage our emissions. And it needs us to have a really concerted effort in all countries very soon to try and hit that pathway where we start reducing our carbon emissions. We have a central, and then the RC 8.5, which is the one that we use as engineers, and it's prudent that we do design to this, which is the higher emissions scenario. But that's the path we're on at the moment, where emissions continue to rise rapidly, then stabling off at 2100. But for the time being, I'm going to be using RCP 8.5 in my discussions. It's just worth touching on percentiles. We see this quite a lot. The 95th percentile, so of all the modelling that was done, there's only about 5% likelihood of higher sea level rise than that. So again, you may say, am I being alarmist looking at this? Well, no, I don't think so. When we're looking at design, it's prudent to take in a higher, a more extreme case. But when we look down at the 50 percentile, so there is a 50% chance that sea level rise will be higher than this. Actually, there isn't a huge amount of difference in there. So yeah, whichever way we look at it, whichever emission scenario we're on, whichever percentile we look at, we can see that sea levels are rising. Excuse me, slight problem with mouse movement. So I'm going to move now into how do we design for this rising sea level, and what have we got to start thinking about? So you'll all recognise Brunel's railway line here at Dawlish. And when we think about coastal management works, we have to look at as we talked about before, the height of the tide and the time. We have to think about the sea level rise. which could be quite severe, as we've seen, half to a metre of sea level rise. We have to think about the surge height, how much higher the water is going to be because of that wind and the pressure effect. We have to think about how big the waves are going to be and which direction they're going to come from. So these are all things that, as an engineer, I must understand. I've also got to think about which way the wind's blowing and how strong it will be. And then really importantly, and it's something that quite a lot of people miss, is what is the beach or the foreshore or the rock platform doing? So if you can imagine standing on a really sandy beach, shallow beach, up to your ankles, the waves aren't going to be much bigger than ankle depth. And that's because waves, broadly speaking, are limited, depth limited. So they can't get much bigger than the depth of water they're in. So if we take this little beach here, when the water starts lapping up here, we've got small waves. When the water's deep here, as it has been, we know, then the waves get much bigger because they are not breaking in shallow water. And so if our beach is high, it's generally safer. If we've got good salt marsh protection, we're breaking up wave activity. But if the beach or the foreshore isn't there, we can get much bigger waves traveling from offshore to inshore. Now, over the last 10,000 years or so, our beaches generally have been able to respond to sea level rise through erosion and building back up. But as soon as we start building hard defences, the wave energy increases in this area and beaches start drawing down, which means that bigger waves can come in, which means that we've got more forces and probably more flood risk. So it's something really important for us. The beach or the foreshore is our primary defence mechanism. We have to think about what needs protecting, what's behind it, whether it's going to rain or not. There's a lot of factors that come into it. So I'm just going to talk through one particular case study that I'm working on at the moment, which is Looe in Cornwall, not too far from Plymouth. According to The Guardian and the Plymouth Herald, it has the dubious title of being Britain or England's most flooded town. And I can attest to that. It really does flood often, many times a year. In fact, it was on Simon Reeve's Cornwall programme just a few days ago. Now, Looe residents, businesses really do understand the importance of sea level rise in the future of the town, and they are well progressed on a flood risk management scheme for Looe. So it's led by Cornwall Council with the support of the Environment Agency, Harbour Commissioners, and then a whole host of other groups in Looe, all who have a stakeholder or relationship with how this town works and how it needs to be kept safe. And what we're trying to do is stop the tide coming up and also stop surface water flooding here, and do it in such a way that we don't sterilise the town for the future. So here's a diagrammatic map of what a flood will look like in 100 years' time for a relatively extreme event. But actually it floods every year now, and there's hundreds of properties that flood in Looe, commercial and residential. And each time it floods, there's an impact on the economy and also mental health and welfare. I mustn't forget, of course, that it's not just large spring tides or surge events that cause problems in Looe. There's also a big factor of wave energy coming in and affecting the town. And in solving one problem, we can't leave another one behind. So surface water, for example, is a problem there. There's no point in us fixing a tidal or wave-induced problem if we leave that surface water problem behind, because the town will still be blighted. We have erosion risk. The harbour, quite recently has suffered some wall collapses due to wave energy through there. We've got massive transport impacts through there. the town is pretty much cut off, not only affecting the people who live there, but people who try and move through that region as well. So any flood in Looe has an impact on the whole of East Cornwall. People often forget there's a lot of stuff underground. Every time Looe floods, those services underground, the sewers, the cables, etc., are prone to damage. And the sewers, for example, also have the potential to leach out things that we don't really want to go into our water. So when you add it all up, it really is quite a compelling case to do something in Looe. Using the Treasury rules that we've talked about earlier. In fact, the Treasury Green Book is being revised in the next few days, and I hope that will give us renewed impetus to look at managing these sorts of risks and providing net zero or carbon reduction incentives. But at Looe, over the next 100 years, we reckon there's somewhere in the region of £160 million worth of damage. Which means there's a compelling case for us to invest in Looe to try and reduce or even stop that impact. Now, the scheme here recognises the community's need to have a relationship with the sea and not build up big walls. So it's likely that we'll be looking at tidal gate or gates to stop the water flowing up into the town. And some form of cut-off wall to stop the groundwater and some of the overtop water going into the town. And of course, that has a negative impact in terms of visual impact. It has a potentially negative impact in terms of mobility, how vessels move in and out. But it's something that we need to talk to the community about if they're prepared to accept that. We also know that we need to reduce that wave activity. So coupled with a barrier will be some form of breakwater to stop the wave energy, which at first sight looks horrendous in terms of cost and visual impact and environmental impact. But actually, as we start to explore this scheme as it develops over the next few years, I hope that that breakwater actually will be a source of additional revenue by providing safety for the town and sheltering vessels, taking the new electric ferry from Plymouth or the next breed of them so that we can have sea transport to Looe, and then work with the community and the environmental groups to see if we can put environmental features on that breakwater to make it more than just a flood defence. And so the council, the Environment Agency, the Harbour Commissioners are a third of the way through a very long journey in trying to get these defences in to stop Looe from flooding. And that journey includes environmental impact assessment, legal, etc., etc. But what's it going to deliver? And I think that the whole group here are committed to reducing the flood risk to allow everything else to go ahead. So we cannot remove planning blight if Looe still floods. We cannot create safer roads, the cycle hub and the cycle route. All these things won't go ahead unless we can stop Looe from flooding. So actually we're turning it on its head a little bit now, and we're looking at all the improvements that can be delivered because of the flood risk to create that much wider business case for progressing this. And as people have said, that will be right down from the individual to the local authority, to the town council, to the government to provide investment in that. And it's worth noting that even with £160 million worth of damage, Looe still needs additional funds to make this scheme successful. And I think by linking up all the various outcomes of a flood risk management scheme, we will be able to deliver regeneration, community improvement, wildlife and biodiversity improvements, etc., if we play our cards right now and bring everything together. So I'm going to move on to some stark messages now. Question for you. You've seen this graph, which is the current day design water levels for Looe. If we have a 1 in 1,000 year event today, what's that going to look like in the year 2080 if we carry on with our emission scenarios? So will it be a 1 in 50, 1 in 1? Just see what your thoughts are. This is to, yeah. See if some results are coming in, Miles. So I check the time to make sure I'm not going too far over.
Nearly there.
Okay. I should
Interesting
point out,
on this one.
yeah. So how much more frequent can we expect flooding? So yeah, most of you think we're going to go, it's going to get more severe. You're absolutely right. We've seen the sea level graphs, sea level rise graphs. But actually using the Environment Agency data, which is all freely available, and previously in the presentation, you'll see the links to these data, and using the highest emission scenario, it's absolutely, staggering to think that a 1 in 1,000 year event, if we draw that line across with projected sea level rise, in only 2080, that's the lifetime of my children, is going to be less than a 1 in 1 year event. So we really have a time to wake up to reducing our carbon emissions and to start really planning for this future. So Lou may have a t-shirt that says the most flooded town in England, but pretty soon it's going to have t-shirts as to be the climate champions of the Southwest as they really start to feel the impacts and try and start working with it and managing it. All right, struggling to move forward. There we go. And I'll just, we're talking about sea level rise and Lou, but I just want to draw your attention to some research that my colleague Jack Heslop is doing for Devon County Council. And it's in its infancy, so we're still working on it, but for a fluvial event, so river flooding, a 100-year event in that same 2080s epoch will become a 1 in 3 year event. So big increase in fluvial river flooding. And if we look at surface water, same again, a really big increase in the likelihood of flooding due to rainfall, so surface water. So we've got sea level rise, river flooding, and surface water flooding all set to increase. And as a community in the Southwest, we need to do something about it by reducing our carbon and by getting ready to work collectively to try and reduce that risk with physical measures. I just want to go back to sea level rise. So this is Exmouth. This is how high a wall needs to be today to stop flooding. That's how high the wall needs to be at the end of the century to stop flooding. And so this wall has gone in actually at Exmouth now. Some of my co-professionals have designed that. And it's being designed so it can be increased in height, so it can adapt in 50 years' time. That's how high the wall, if we carry on with our emission scenario, will need to be at the end of the next century. So that's 2200. And clearly that's unacceptable. So I'm running out of time. What we have to do is stop kicking the can down the road. So this isn't somebody's problem in 2 generations' time. Actually, this is my problem. This is my children's generation that really will having to deal with that. And so we really do have to start working together to, 1, be able to adapt to this changing climate and the increase in flood risk, and 2, to really give ourselves a kick up the arse and start thinking about reducing our emissions. So finishing off, if we look back at Lou, that's 100 years ago. It doesn't actually look that much different now, although the economy has changed. We need Lou and the other places around Devon and Cornwall not to change too dramatically, but not to be blighted by increased risk. So I shall stop there as I gently run over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hamish. That's brilliant. Thank you. Lots to think about there. Just for everyone as well, the whole webinar is being recorded. So all the slides and everything we've spoken about will be available on our website, futureplymouth2030.co.uk very soon. So now we move on to questions. I know the panelists have been answering some of your questions that you've been typing in. If you would like to ask a question to one of our panelists, please raise your hand down below, and we'll put you through. We have got one question that's come in the Q&A box. Probably one for Paul. Is tidal energy being looked at for the integration with the breakwater, Paul?
Not as far as I'm aware. I mean, we have done some studies around generation from wind and from other sources in the past as part of our sort of planning work that we've done for what became our joint local plan, but not directly aware of any proposals linked to the breakwater. But certainly something that well, I don't think anything should be ruled in or out. Certainly needs to be looked at, but I'm not personally aware of anything.
Okay, thank you very much. One for you, Hamish. Those damages indicate that this place we should be this is a place we should be relocating in the longer term. Will Lou really be there in 23,000 with 4 meter SLR? You did say that we need to plan for the more extreme conditions. It may take 100 years to move Lou.
Yeah, so Lou floods at the moment, and the community there understand that and are dealing with it, but actually they can't carry on much longer in the state that they are, dealing with that repeat flooding. So I think what we need to do now is buy ourselves 100 years to allow that community to adapt, to flourish, to move, to change, and buy ourselves time to try and reverse the climate change impacts. I should note that I've been showing you the extreme sea level rise graphs. Actually, I hope we can move away from that, and I also hope that those predictions will start coming down. But yeah, I would hope that somewhere as Lou can continue, albeit in a slightly different way.
Thank you very much. Would anyone like to ask a question? We have none at the moment. A couple of questions. One for you, Paul. You mentioned Plymouth City Council's carbon emissions only accounted for 1% of the city in total. Does this include Scope 3 emissions? And if not, are you taking action to include these?
No, it doesn't, and we're not currently including Scope 3 emissions, but that again is part of the consideration of how we monitor the success of the actions that we are implementing. As I hinted at in my remarks, the issue is how do we make sure that we recognise that action is needed at every level, from the individual up to international communities and everything in between. But how do we also make sure that we're making a real difference? So our very strong philosophy has been to target actions that are making a real difference. And of course, we have to do that. And there's been a number of questions about why can't we, for example, change the building regs? Well, the answer to that question, which would obviously at one fell swoop, A, create a level playing field, and B, would mandatorily require buildings to meet a certain energy efficiency level. The answer to that, of course, is that it requires primary legislation, and that's in the gift of the government, not the city council. So there's always a tension here between what the city council can do, what individual organisations can do, what individuals can do, what communities can do, and what, in all frankness, government has to do, because government has the legislative power to do. Now, some would use that as an excuse for not taking action. Why should Plymouth take action on something if Bristol's not doing it or somebody else is not doing it? Might they get a competitive advantage by not being so robust in addressing the climate emergency issues, so that a development goes to Bristol instead of coming to Plymouth? I mean, those are real tensions. They're not made up tensions. So we are looking at how we should monitor the emissions and how we can demonstrate we're moving towards net zero, and the scope 3 provisions are part of that that future discussion. So no, not at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. We've got a question coming in from Gregor. Hi there, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Hopefully I've unmuted.
Yes,
it was really going back to the question I asked of Paul, and thank you for your response, Paul. But I was really meaning sort of a different form of adaptation, almost coming to what Hamish was talking about. And we obviously there is the emergency around mitigation, but how do we get forward planners to really start taking on board the larger scale adaptation in relation to the coast? You know,
right. Yes, your question was
abandoning.
Right, your question was
sorry, carry on.
Sorry, your question was more profound than I thought. I thought it was about the adaptation of buildings, but really what you're identifying is the most fundamental thing we could do as a society, which is obviously locate development in the most sustainable locations, because that will impact travel patterns. It will impact, therefore, on emissions. If people can walk and cycle to their local shop to buy bread and all sorts of things like that. You know, there's the concept of the 15-minute city. This all plays into a wider view about the location of development. And so that is clearly one of the most fundamental things that the planning system does. It identifies what development should go where. And part of that, I think increasingly will be how development is located to address these issues. So that for me is one of the most fundamental things that the planning system now needs to rise to. It certainly is why we've made some very strong representations as a city council, as indeed as have others, in relation to the government's recently published planning white paper proposing a whole series of reforms to the planning system. And I think the most diplomatic description I could give to the government's proposals in that planning white paper in relation to what it says about climate emergency is woefully inadequate. Climate-related issues are barely mentioned. There's a bit about tree planting, and nobody's saying, incidentally, tree planting isn't necessarily a good thing. It is a good thing, but it's not the solution in and of itself. The solution in and of itself is making sure that development is well designed, well located, is built to a standard that minimizes carbon emissions from the start. And all of those things come together and it's been done around we've done it, this country has a proud tradition of new towns, which at the time were dealing with some of these issues about, local food production, about, social infrastructure. It can be done. It is being done around the world. But you get to a very important point about the philosophy of what you want your planning system to deliver. So for me, actually that question for me as a planner is absolutely central to how we're going to address this issue, because self-evidently, if you put out of centre retailing, if you put greenfield developments in the middle of nowhere, which require massive road-based transport infrastructure, generating traffic movements for people to drive 6 miles down the road to get a loaf of bread, by definition you've lost the position already. So actually that is one of the most profound changes I think we need to see.
I would take this up one level I'd take this up one level in response to Hamish's response on Lou. It will take us 100 years to fully adapt Lou to what they are facing. Isn't that, and we've got to, Hamish's defences buy us time to plan, and therefore that planning now for that change is part of the emergency.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you, Gregor. We have another question from Alan Ramage. Alan, are you with us?
Hello. London has congestion charges. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think London has congestion charges. Given the city's planned 30,000 extra homes and the external daily inflow and outflow of peak time traffic, shouldn't these be given consideration? I do know that from a local councillor that it's seen as a no-no. It's the live rail of politics. It's guaranteed to get you voted out of power. Nevertheless, there ought to be a way of bringing people alongside the need to accept this for air quality standards, congestion, all the factors that need to be taken into account, apart from reduction in emissions.
Maybe I'll just kick off.
That was for Paul, by the way.
Oh, sorry, okay. Yeah.
But anybody else can.
I'm more than happy Hamish can have a go first if he wants to, but well, the answer to that is there are no plans to introduce a congestion charge in Plymouth. So that's the short answer. The longer answer would be to refer you back to what I said in terms of the overall transport strategy for the city, which is to move towards a system that is public transport based, and where that last sort of mile of the journey, I like to think, facilitated by the creation of 30 to 50 mobility hubs that we're going to be implementing in the next 2 years, where people can take that last bit of the journey on an electric bike, as part of an electric car club, or indeed an electric vehicle, indeed an electric taxi. I should have said, we're also looking at electric taxis as part of that work as well. So that we see it as a public transport based and walking and cycling based answer, not a policy around introduction of congestion charging, which is not, there are no plans for as we speak.
May I just come back on that very briefly? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
We're all aware of the topography of Plymouth. I used to cycle 5 miles to and from my work each day, but it was across from Plymstock to Devonport, so it was relatively level. But occasionally I'd go up to St Martin St John for a teacher's course, a long slug up, a wonderful freewheel down, whee all the way down. You think of the range of the families, the aging population, people with disabilities and so on. Are you taking that sufficiently into account in your thinking? I'm sure you are, but I'm asking the question nevertheless.
Yeah, you're right. There are obviously different users, and we need to make sure that we're taking account of that. I mean, clearly, through concessionary fares and things of that kind, we're supporting people. I mean, clearly, there's a public health dimension to this discussion as well, as we're all too now familiar with, in terms of the impact on people's mental health and indeed their general health. And people have been rediscovering their bikes, and we provide various support for people to repair their bikes and bike training to get people out there. But you're right, there's clearly different types of users, and we need to reflect that in the overall transport strategy. I think it is reflected, but it's a well-made point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I quite like this question that's coming from Greg Slater. Probably a question for you, Iain. It still doesn't feel like we're on emergency footing nationally. How might we collectively influence the move beyond what is clearly a long-standing and widespread knowledge, but inadequate pace of change?
Yeah, I think that's the key question. And I think Paul's alluded to that too. It's behavioural change. It's how we bring on people on board. And, in the past, the assumption has been, certainly from the scientific point of view, is all people need is more information, that as soon as we give them this information, they'll suddenly magically see the world the way we see it, and they'll go for that. So the argument's always about trying to get better information and communicate it better. But actually it's not. It's about, because there's plenty of information. And there's lots of consensus around the problem. there's a lot less consensus around the solution. And I think that's where we need to have those climate conversations that Paul alluded to. We need dialogue. People have to see this as part of their future rather than something that's imposed upon them. And that's not an easy task, you know, behavioral change. We're seeing it with COVID. It's hard in any of these complex contested areas. And so I think that's where the attention needs to go, about being less about, I mean, I think, again, Paul mentioned this about the conversations not unpacking whether it's happening and how much is human and how much is natural. The reality is it's happening, and what do we do about it, and how do we want our communities to evolve? That's the conversations, and I think it is things that will happen at the local level. And it's interesting, be part of the Scottish Climate Assembly. I mean, it's early days and it's an online forum, but it's fantastic just talking to ordinary people that I often haven't thought anything about climate change, and suddenly having those discussions. The one thing I would say, and there's a number of questions related to that in the Q&A and in the chat around, you know, we kind of assume that these things are linear, they build up over time, and you know, these changes, most of the changes, either in the climate system or in the human system, are exponential. They start off slow and they pick up pace and accelerate, and suddenly, you know, you're really going for it. And I think that's the same with the public. I think you know, these conversations might take a while to get going, but the pace of change will pick up, partly because the urgency will kick in. But the big changes have to happen in the next 5 years. A lot of the big changes have to happen then. And there will be things longer term down the line that we have to look for. That's locked in. There was stuff around sea level rise, for example, and things. But if we do not get action and a change start in the next 5 years, we're kind of stuffed, really. So I think that the key thing will be starting to accelerate those conversations.
Thanks, Iain. Nigel Horwell, are you there?
Yes, I am. Yeah, it's a question for Paul Barnard, actually, following on from that recent answer he gave. I was just wondering what communications are being, or conversations being had with neighbouring authorities regarding easing transport into the city centre, i.e., you know, park and rides and Saltash for links to Derriford.
Yeah, I mean, we've only got the seventh. It's only the seventh joint local plan in the country, which we adopted in March 2019. And so the fact that it was done jointly for the first time ever with South Hams and West Devon gives an indication to the thinking about not only tying environmental issues across the administrative borders together, but also those points I was making earlier in response to the question about the location of development. So clearly that started that journey. In addition to that, we obviously have regular conversations with Devon as the adjoining transport authority to ourselves, and obviously with Cornwall. And so there are discussions going on around issues around park and ride. There's a park and ride planned in relation to the Sherford development, for example. So there are those discussions. We're also in discussions with surrounding authorities and further afield, I should say, elsewhere in the country, to transplant that good practice. Coming back to the point about how do we get people engaged, I've been to some very inspirational events of our promotion team who promote sustainable travel through the work they do with schools, with primary schools, and it's just very inspirational to see the children and some of the things that they've done around encouraging not only themselves to safely cycle and walk to school, but pressurizing their parents to do the same. So I believe that there's more we can do there to create that sense of ownership of this issue, as opposed to it being imposed, as Iain rightly said. But yes, we are looking to transplant best practice from anywhere and everywhere, because I think that's the right thing to be doing. If somebody's come up with a solution to a problem and we're able to transplant it in Plymouth, why would we spend time reinventing the wheel? Which is why I sort of emphasized the point about actions right at the start. I'm really not interested in strategizing. I'm really not interested in extensive, very worthy discussions about an issue that is blatantly an existential challenge for us as a society. What I am interested in is real deliverable actions, which is why I'm not going to be apologetic for the fact that what we've tried to do is identify actions. I'm very happy to be challenged about they're not ambitious enough and there's more that needs to be done. And I'd be the first to be saying, you're right, we do need to do more, which is why I said about ratcheting up the actions. But for me, it's about a multifaceted sort of approach. But I genuinely believe that schools could be absolutely central to this. But it's also about sharing that good practice across different organisations and different authorities. So yes, we are working with in Cornwall and Devon, South Hams and West Devon.
Thank you. Good answer.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for your question, Nigel. A question for you, Hamish. How and when will sea levels affect how people view and connect with the ocean and decide to live by the sea or be by the sea?
Well, it's happening now. So yeah, most of the coast protection sea defence schemes that we work on, it is the visual impact that people get upset about first and foremost. And we have many schemes where actually it's the people right on the seafront who want to keep their relationship with the sea and will be prepared to accept flooding. So Exmouth is a good example where a group, a community there have elected not to have the sea defence, but to have it set back. And in the future, they will have to adapt to that. But actually, it's you know, I'm generalising here. It's the people on the seafront who sometimes can afford to be flooded. It's the people in the hinterland who can't afford to be flooded, but they rely. So it's setback defences that we employ there, and we try and integrate that with other infrastructure, walkways, parks, you know, so that it doesn't look like a big defence. And you know, for Looe or Plymouth, Barbican, those seafront areas are really important. And you don't want a defence that's going to work once every 50 or 100 years to blight something that people use every hour of every day. So it's a balance there of understanding risk management and what's affordable.
Thanks, Hamish. Another question for you, Iain, from Sarah Gibson in the chat. What do you think of the 2050 target to achieve carbon neutrally set by the UK government and others? It feels too long. What do you think?
Well, it's not enough, but you know, even Scotland's got 2045, and that's not enough. And if you think of the Scottish one, the Scottish targets actually include aviation and shipping, and it's still not enough to reach Paris Agreement. None of them are. Most climate scientists will tell you that in private. Very few of them will say it in public. But I think have to be careful. I mean, I think the years of when we reach it don't really matter. 2050, 2045, 2040, having that discussion doesn't really matter, because we need to start moving in the next 5 years to do this. And I think it's this point that when we start to really move, things will start to accelerate. So I don't think anyone will be complaining if we do it earlier than that. The science says that, you know, certain things will reach it by 2050, but actually that's partly because we're parking the problem into the long grass with carbon capture storage. It's allowing us to do try to get negative emissions later on. So the assumption is that our next generation will have this whole industry that we don't have at the moment that'll save us, really, and that's factored into those agreements. That's why it's possible to technically reach it by 2050. So we have to make certain assumptions that things are already going to happen, that our next generation is going to be, you know, doing all of this stuff. But the sharp reality is if we do not start in the next few years to move and peak and get down, all of these dates are completely irrelevant. So I really, in the Scottish Assembly, we've decided to not get fixed on the date, because what happens is you fix on the date and then you reverse engineer it and you say, well, if it's 2050, then it has to be this and it has to be this. And you start thinking of this linear process. You know, I think the point is, we need to get people motivated in action now and start putting in demonstrable, meaningful changes that can start to scale up, start to accelerate. And that's when I think we'll get, you know, the real momentum behind this, rather than us starting to track it, you know, chart out some kind of timeline. So I don't get fixated with the dates, but I think we do need to get fixated with the start of action.
Thanks, Iain. Just a couple more questions I think we've just got time for. For Hamish and Iain again, I think from Sally, there's a lag time between carbon emissions and thermal expansion if we stop emitting GHGs today. So what is the minimum period we have to accommodate for, in terms for sea level rise?
I'm going to hand that one to Iain.
Well, it's centuries. I mean, what's quite depressing with sea level change is that, you know, that thermal expansion, so that warming of the upper part of the ocean, which then gradually moves down, and then you get that broader. That's locked in. So we're going to have more warming, but even if we stopped it today, that expansion would continue. And so I think it's a couple of centuries before that finds its way out. And that's pretty terrifying. You know, the idea that, you know, we might have to move London seems crazy, science fiction, far-fetched. And yet, when you look at the scenarios of the sea level kind of change over the, you know, the coming century or 2 centuries, if we think of it that way, you cannot see somewhere like London being there in the way that it is a major conurbation in that sense, which is extraordinary. And then if you just look at, you know, Bangkok or Bangladesh and things like that, then it just becomes really frightening. So I think that, but maybe the way to look at it is this. I mean, it's such a long-term lag effect. We've got a lot more problems in the short term to worry about that. That is something we need to think about, especially because of the coastalization tendencies around the world of people wanting to live by the shores. But I think we really need to focus on some of the shorter term things that are going to be much more immediate, because there's just certain things that we can't address at the moment.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, we've got flooding is a serious problem now. You know, that's even before we think about climate change. And the thing that, you know, what worries me is that there isn't going to be funding like we have funding at the moment. So me being able to call on a DEFRA pot or an Environment Agency pot or a European pot isn't going to be around for very long, I don't think, because there will be more urgent investment requirements. And so we, as Gregor was saying, we have to buy ourselves time for us to adapt to a change in climate and how we're going to fund that, whether it's climate change or biodiversity. We are going to have to think about how we fund this and take more personal responsibility for it.
Can I just add one thing, which is the irony is the actual climate effects in the UK are going to be comparatively mild. So we're probably all getting despondent looking at the graphs, and that's as a country and an area that's going to be relatively less affected than most parts of the world. So that kind of puts it into perspective.
Yes, climate refugees, and yeah, Bangladesh is a case in example. If you look at that graph for Bangladesh as to the area underwater, it is horrendous. And so we're going to have displaced communities who will need support.
Thank you both. And then finally, we've just got time for one more question for you, Paul, from Melanie. Have Plymouth City Council considered signing up Plymouth up for artificial lighting changes, such as International Dark Sky Association?
It was something that came up as an issue during the local plan, but no is the short answer. It's not something that we've looked at, other than through that consideration when it was raised as part of looking at future developments in the city.
Brilliant. Okay, I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for joining us. I really hope you found this interesting. Thank you to all our guests. Thank you to Hamish, Iain and Paul. Please do join us next time on December the 2nd, the same time at 4 p.m. for Embodied Energy and Whole Life Carbon. We have special guest Simon Sturgis and a few other guests as well. So please join us then and have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.